Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be hanging out with our primeweld MIG 180. In this video, we're going to be going over how to set this machine up and dial in those settings for the MIG function specifically. So hopefully we can make some good strong welds that look something like this. So one of the questions I've got frequently asked about this machine is, what are your settings? Now that can be kind of a hard question to answer because there's several variables that can affect your settings, such as the atmosphere around you, your techniques, and the thickness of your material. So in this video, we're going to go over a little of both. We're going to go over the settings that I use and the techniques that I use to complement those settings and get the best results. We're also going to be showing the difference in those settings, whether you have the machine plugged into 110 volts or 220 volts. So we're going to go through with a couple of coupons. For 110, we have 16 gauge, 1/8 inch wall, and some 1/4 inch plate. And then for the 220, we have some 1/8 inch tubing, we have some 1/4 inch plates, and then we even have some 1/2 inch plates here. This is all cold metal. I'll hit it with the temp gun, show you guys. So this is going to be the machine doing all the work. There's not going to be any preheat here, and we'll see what we can come up with. So first off, we want to set up our MIG function, and we want to go to the front of the machine. Obviously, we want to make sure that our MIG stinger is plugged in, and then these little guys here, we want to make sure that this lead is going to be plugged into our positive, and then our ground lead is going to be plugged into the negative side. If you're going to be doing flux core, we want those flip-flopped. Now we're going to come up here and look at our options. Now we have a selector button up here for either MIG or stick, and we're going to want make sure that is indicated on the MIG. We also have a selector down here for T2 and T4. Now, for the purposes of today, we are going to have this in T2, so that will be the option on the left side. On the top side, we have our voltage, and on the bottom side, we have our wire speed. Now, these are designated whether you are plugged into 110 volts or 220 volts by the colors. So if you look closely, we are going to have the gray in the 110 volts, and the outer ring is red in the 220 volts. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to come over and look at our argon. So I'm running 75-25 here, and if you're in a controlled environment, like in your garage or something, you're not going to need that much. So we got the machine turned on here, we're hit the button, and you can see that I'm running just under 15 CFH in this controlled environment. And what I mean by controlled environment is I'm inside, there's not a cross breeze. The only cross breeze that you might have to watch out for is the fans on your machine, honestly. If you have that sitting on the table like we have here, that is something you do have to consider. So some people like to run a lot more gas. I say run it at the minimum if it is performing correctly, because there's no sense spending money on more gas than you need. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go over to the side of the machine, and honestly, I base almost all my settings off of factory specs, and then I tweak it from there. So we're going to take a look at the inside of the cover here to get our base starting settings. So first off, we're running 75-25 hardwire. That's your MIG, you're going to be running hardwire. So we're going to run over here and find our gauge, which is going to be right between 17 and 14. And the first slash here indicates your voltage. So we're going to be somewhere in between 16 and 18 volts. And we are going to be somewhere in between 150 and 270 inches a minute for your wire speed. Now, I prefer to run a little hotter, so I am going to probably be going and just starting off with the 14 gauge settings. So now remember that our colors are designated by what voltage we have the machine plugged into. So we're on 110, so we're going to be running 18 volts, which this one is designated for us. If it's not designated, you kind of have to split the difference and guess. And then we had, I forget what the wire speed was, it was 200 and something. So we're just going to go right here with the 236 and see how that runs. So the first thing we're going to start off with today is our 16 gauge tubing. And we'll take a look at this guy, and this guy's at 50 degrees, so we know we got cold material here. So with the thin stuff like this, the technique that I like to use is just a straight pass. So we're just going to be moving at a consistent speed. You always want to push your weld. So you always want a slight angle into your weld, and you want to push it across. Some people are going to argue with that, but 80% of the time you're going to get better penetration when you push that weld. So let's run a bead here. And there we are. That does not look too bad. Okay, so the reason I like to use the straight bead technique on thinner material is a couple reasons. Number one, like I said, I like to run a little hot so that those toes are nicely wet in. And in order to run hot, you have to run fast so you don't blow through. Also with thinner material, you do not need as much filler to make a qualifying weld. So like this is 16th inch material, so this is like a 1/8 inch weld on a 16th inch material. Whereas if you're gonna be running a 1/2 inch weld with 030 wire, you're gonna have to run slower and fill in to be able to get the mass and the material in that weld to get a qualifying weld that's gonna pass an inspection or just hold together really well. So that's the reason that we make a straight weld. We'll make a couple of these so you can kind of see how that goes and see if we can get some arc shots. Okay, so another technique that we're going to use for this thin material is going to be the direction that we weld it and the angle that we weld it. And what I mean by that is when you have a joint like this with a open tube and then this is on the round corner, another thing that's going to help you out is we're going to hold our torch at a slight angle towards the corner of the tube opposed to this direction. And the reason being is this is that 16th inch tubing, so we have a really thin wall across here, but this rounded corner got more mass in it than the edge of this tube. So therefore, if we're pointing that torch at this angle, we're going to be putting most of our heat into that rounded corner and be a lot less likely to blow that out, and that weld going to be looking a lot nicer. So let's run that through. And there we go. As you can see, it's a pretty clean weld. The toes are wet in on the edges. I'm a little cold on the stop there. Technically, you don't want to stop on a corner. Technically, you want to wrap your corners if we're being technical, but for starting out, that's going to work great for you. So let's move up to our 1/8 inch material. Okay, so we're going to move up to our 1/8 inch material, and 1/8 inch material is going to be somewhere in between this 5/32 and 11 gauge. So like I said, I like to run it hot. And remember, we are on 110, so we're going to want to be somewhere in between 19 volts and 350 inches a minute and 19.8 volts and 394 inches a minute. So remember, we're still on 110 volts, so we're going to roll this guy. There's not a marker for 19, but we have 21 right here and 18 right here, so we can say that 19 is going to be somewhere right in the center of that. And then the chart said somewhere around 300 inches a minute. So we have a 315 marking down here and a 230. So I'm just going to take a guess that we're going to be right somewhere in there. That's one of the things that's more difficult about this machine, and there's not digital readout, but it also is one of the things that lets them bring this to you at a good price point. Okay, so next we have our 1/8 inch wall tubing. And with this, like I said, we went with our factory settings, and the technique I'm going to use on this is a small upside down cursive. Now, I know some people are anti-whip out there, and as long as you do it right and your toes are pretty consistent, it's going to be just as strong, and it's going to look clean and be easier to lay down flat and get good penetration. So what we're going to do is those upside down cursive. So we're going to start at the top of our joint, 45 degrees into the joint, and we're going to start, we're going to whip around and hold for half a second at the top. Whip around, hold for half a second at the top. Whip around, hold for half a second at the top. And while you're doing this, you're going to be watching the toes of your weld. And the toes of the weld are the outside edges of that weld. And what you're looking for is for that weld to fill itself out to the same width as your last bead. And rule of thumb, you want to be thirds. So you want to move over a third of your last bead and then do your next one and move over a third. You don't want to spread those out too far, because that's where those people that are anti-whippers are right. If you spread those out too far, it definitely will leave way for stress fractures or stress risers in that weld. So make sure only move over a third of your bead at a time, and we'll give this 1/8 inch a go. And there we are. That doesn't look too bad. So we're on 110 volts, remember, still, so we definitely had to take our time a little more than when we have it plugged into 220 and make sure that those toes are completely wetted out. As you can see, if you look closely here, I only jumped over 1/3 of a puddle each one, so that those outside toes of the weld are pretty flat and consistent across the top. We don't want to see variations in that because that can cause those stress risers. So let's look at one through an arc shock now. Now if we look right here, this is a good example of what I was talking about before. You can see a little bit of porosity on the top of this, and that is because I went against my own advice there. And if you look, our machine is right there, and those cooling fans are blowing a slight breeze that you can feel on that weld. So we're going to stick a chunk of cardboard up against the machine so we don't get that breeze across the table, and we're going to do the other side. Now, as you can see, that one looks much better. It laid down flatter, so we actually had some shielding gas there. So next off, we're going to do our 1/4 inch. Now, this machine doesn't actually have a chart setting for 1/4 inch, and even for 3/16, it's for an 040 wire. So we're just going to have to do some guessing from here. We're going to go to the front of the machine here. By the way, I didn't use cardboard. I used a chunk of sheet metal, which is better, non-flammable. And I'm going to crank this guy almost all the way up on my volts and all the way up on my wire speed, because we're going to be doing 1/4 inch and we're still plugged into our 110 outlet. You can see it over there down in the corner. So with the 1/4 inch, I'm still going to be using the same whip technique, and it is going to be an upside down E. The only difference is we are going to hold a little longer on the top because we're going to need more time. Since we only have that 030 wire, we need more time for that heat to get into the material and for it to be able to wet out and get the correct width and depth that you're going to want to see in that weld. And there we are. That does not look too bad. The front side of the weld looks a little bit better. As you can see, as it warmed up, I was moving faster, and I'm just slightly underfilled on the back side, you can see there. But the front side looks great. We've got an obtuse weld. It's clean. Our toes are all wet out evenly, and that would be a good 1/4 inch weld. And honestly, this is really impressive, being so that that is only on 110 volts still. You can see on the back side here, you can see our heat signature, and we even had just a little bit of bleed through, which is good. That means we're getting good penetration through that. And here we are. I'm pleasantly surprised every time we use this machine. As you can see, there's that 1/4 inch. It wet in very nicely. I have a little bit of inconsistencies right in here, but for the most part, those toes on the outside are pretty consistent. And just for a little perspective here, that is like 3/8 of an inch wide welds. This machine does have a shorter duty cycle. I could tell I welded all these things here straight through, and with this thick stuff, by the end of these 2 welds, I could tell the machine was starting to bear down a little bit. So we're going to give it a rest for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back, plug it into 220, and we're going to weld some thicker stuff. Okay, so now that we let the machine rest for about 10 minutes, we're going to jump right in to our thick stuff. So we switched the machine over to 220, so we're no longer on that wall outlet right there. We're plugged in right down here at our 220 outlet. and we're going to adjust the settings on the machine. So now that we're plugged into 220, we're going to be going off of the red part of the dials. So when we're on gray and into 110, all the way down here was 21 volts. So now we're on 220, we're going to dial it back to this 23 volt mark, and I'm going to be welding some 1/2 inch there, and I'm going to run this back to somewhere right around 450 inches a minute-ish, and we'll give that a try for our 1/2 inch. Okay, so we have our 1/2 inch coupon here, and we're going to hit this with the temp gun to show you guys. And we're just under 50 degrees, so that's a big, thick, cold chunk of metal there. And there we are. That does not look too bad. So that was cold material, and that is 1/2 inch. Let's get a tape measure up here so that you can get just a little bit of perspective on that guy. And that guy is probably right around 3/8 of an inch wide. Laid down real nice. Look down it. Look down the end of it here. We're going to run one more down the back side of this guy. And there we go. That one wet in just even a little bit flatter. That's because our last pass had already got that material a little warmer, and so it was able to, ooh, that's hot, to wet in a little nicer. But you can see that's a nice flat weld on a chunk of 1/2 inch. Okay, so next up we're going to be doing some more 1/4 inch with plugged into our 220 outlet. There are not settings on the inside of the box for 1/4 inch, so I'm going to show you what I'm going to use. And I'm going to shoot this somewhere around 21 volts, so just past the 20 there. I'm going to bring my wire speed somewhere around 350 in there is where I found works really well for that 1/4 inch. So let's attack this open corner. This is 1/4 inch open corner plugged into 220, and we're nice and flat. So on this guy, I started in with the ease and ended up just kind of doing a zigzag pattern. What I mean by that is I worked my way to the edge of the puddle and then back and hold. To the edge of the puddle and back and hold. Just kind of doing a circle, pausing in the center on the back side. And the main things that I'm looking at is making sure that I'm not getting too far ahead of my puddle when I go forward, and then making sure I come back so that I've got 1/3 of an overlap every time. And then the third thing you're looking at is making sure the toes of those welds are the same width all the way across. So you're watching the edge of that weld, making sure the material fills all the way out, and then advancing forward. Come back, make sure you're filled out to the correct width, and advance forward in a slight circle. But that is a pretty good looking weld right there. Let's flip this guy over and do a fillet. Okay, so this guy turned out okay. There's a couple things that I don't like about this. As you've seen, I was kind of jogging back and forth, and I was stopping in the center of the weld. This was thick enough material. I should have been doing a slight rotation, and the reason being is if you look at the profile of this guy, you can see it's kind of high right down the center. The toes are wet out enough, but I would have liked to seen it just a little bit more. So keep that in mind. Keep an eye on your puddle. Make sure that Everything is floating out nicely. We want to stay away from that little bit of a crown. It's not bad weld, but we could do better. And last one we're going to do here again is some of this 1/8 inch tubing. So remember, we're plugged into 220 now. We're going to go look at the side of the box, and if we remember correctly, the chart on the inside was 19 amps and right around 350. So we're on 220 volts, so we're reading off the red markings. So we're going to go just before the 20 for 19 there, and somewhere midway over here for our 350-ish inches per minute. And we're going to be able to run a little faster since this is plugged into 220. The machine's not going to have to work as hard. That's definitely more effortless than when the machine's plugged into 110. So let's get another one of those with an arc shot for you. Okay, so let's go over and just kind of summarize what we've seen here and what we learned. So number one, I would say start off with the base settings in the machine and adjust from there. I realize that only goes up to 3/16, but we can kind of semi-proportionally scale it up from there. As we've seen there, those different techniques are going to react differently, and different techniques are going to have different settings that are going to be complement them. So with the thinner stuff, like I said, I like to run just a nice fast straight bead so I don't blow through, and that's because I like to run it just a little bit hotter than the factory recommend settings there. With the thicker stuff, being so that you're running a smaller diameter wire, that 030 wire, and like that 1/2 inch we had here or our 1/4 inch, we're going to need to slow down and do those nice steady whips and make sure that we fill out that material and get enough material into that weld joint. So when it comes down to the weld itself, the results are what's going to matter. The way you get those results are up to you. Some people might say it's wrong, some people might say it's right, but in the end, what matters is if the results are good. So things to look out for good results is you want good penetration. You want those toes on the outside of the weld, so those toes are your weld line on the perimeter of your weld. You want those to be as even as possible, because if you have bumps in it or variations, that is going to potentially down the line allow stress fractures. You want to have a just above flat weld, so you know you got good heat and penetration in it. You don't want that weld to have a big old crown on top of it, so you want it to sit just barely obtuse inside that joint, whether it's flat or at an angle. And that's what matters in the end, not necessarily how you did it. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully these tips were helpful. Leave a comment if you have another tip that I didn't think of here. I'm always open to learn something and enjoy hearing from you guys. Make sure to like, subscribe, and go build something.